Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk. Time for the show. Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. Right. Welcome back to Once a DJ, everyone. We're here once again with Greg Wilson. Greg, how are you doing today?
Good. Nice sunny day. Here we are in Merseyside and all is well with the world.
Amazing. So we've established you went down a very, very, very deep sort of rabbit hole of the Beatles. At the time, did it feel like you were trying to use it as a distraction?
No, I don't think a distraction. I think what it was doing, as I say, I mean, I'm a child of the 60s, i.e. I was born in 1960. On a history level, that's really good for me because it's, it's like I can pick out years quite quickly. I know when I was 25, because I was born in 60, it's going to be a 5 number, and so it's that kind of thing. I mean, Lennon was born in 40, so that gives another kind of thing on that aspect. So 20 years older than I was. So the 60s, I experienced those as a child, and there was an absolute magic. But obviously, when you're a child, you don't know whether the magic is also because you're a child. So this, But that's why I say the proof's in the pudding with the music. The music exists. It's there. It happened. Wow. It still does those things. I mean, not just the Beatles, but so much music from the 60s. It was just like such a glorious, rich age for creativity, as it was moving into the 70s and on. But the 60s was the kind of special period of optimism. We can change the world. Anything is possible. We've moved away from the greyness of 2 world wars and our parents' and grandparents' generations, and we're making that was the kind of statement of the 60s. A lot of it was naive, when you look back, you can see why certain things didn't work out and would never have worked out. But people believed at that point in time in these things happen. I mean, what's interesting as well was the closest I got to the Beatles was probably a couple of minute walk across. I lived in a house and it was on the back of what we call the Tower Grounds in New Brighton on Merseyside, and the Tower Grounds had the Tower Ballroom. And the Tower Ballroom, where the Beatles played quite, over 40 times, I think, and did certainly over 30. Operation Big Beat, which was, I'm just trying to remember the amount. So is it 20 or 30, over 20 times or 30 times? And trying not to over-egg it. But Operation Big Beat was this major event. This is before the Beatles were signed. In fact, they were signed as they did one of the gigs. They just signed, and Love Me Do had come out, one of the latter gigs that they did. So they came to the Tower Ballroom many times, as did the Rolling Stones and all sorts of different artists. And they played these nights. And so that was the closest proximity I was there. I was a little kid asleep in bed. as they were doing these gigs in the next street to where they were. And my nan, well, my parents as well, but my nan had a guest house, and she told me one of the Rolling Stones stayed there, but I kind of think it may probably have been one of the Road Crew or something like that. But they played at the Tower Ballroom. So yeah, that was it. You know, the Beatles were there as the soundtrack, along with so much other stuff. But the Beatles were just always there. They were, you know, just the four of them. The way as a kid, it was they were just part of the furniture.
Right,
they were just there. For a kid my age who hadn't, you know, by the time you can remember anything properly, you're 2 or 3, and they were making records then. So it was constantly in place. But as I say, through all my time of being a DJ, I'd never had that time to be able to sit down, like I've done with other artists since, like Dylan and stuff. I mean, I knew bits of Dylan stuff, but, you know, it was more recently, over the last, I think it was about 10, 12 years ago, I thought now's the time, and I went album for album and worked out. I wanted to know what happened when and how it all worked out. And I mean, it's amazing, you know. And that came from, as I say, with the Beatles. That's what I did pretty much in the 80s. I mean, I'd done it with Bowie when I was a younger kid. Right. You know, that was where it really started. That, you know, Starman came on Top of the Pops when I was 12. And me, like so many other people in the UK at that point, were really touched by this performance and obviously the track, and I went and bought it. And then I remember saying to the woman saying, I've got another one of his, if you want it. And I was like, oh, right. And it was Changes, and it was the previous single. And, you know, when I got that kind of was a really great example of not all hits are great records, and not all great, you know, some records that aren't hits are great. You know, it was like that hadn't been a hit. I'd never come across that because at the time I looked at the charts, but and to discover that. So what happened with Bowie after that? I just went totally into the obsession that I bought everything I could, and so. You know, when I was 13, I just owned every album that he'd released. I'd found a brilliant bootleg album of his that was called Live in Santa Monica. I think it's had an official release since, but back then it was this amazing live gig that they did from the Ziggy Stardust period. And so, you know, my Bowie obsession went that way, that I just had to hear it all. I just had to work it all out.
Yeah.
And so that was the primer. But as I say, the Beatles was just the vastness of it. It was just how deep and how wide it goes. And for as wide and deep as you know it is, you know it can go further and deeper again.
So were you managing Broken Glass at that point, or did that come later?
No, I came just after all that period, really. It came like kind of mid-80s when, you know, I was, you know, I'd come away from DJing, so I was disconnected there. I'd also got into financial difficulty. The record production side hadn't worked out, and now, you know, I wasn't earning money. I had debts. I had a house. I mean, I basically lost it all. I lost my house eventually. I had a car that I had repayment still on. I lost that. So it was a very bleak period on that level. I was everything was disintegrating around me. And it was around that point where this came into my life, you know, because I remember being so skint, as I say, you know, when I was acquiring these books, it was like looking for bargains. I wasn't going to Waterstones or whatever was the equivalent back then and looking for I was trying to find something for 25p in a bargain bin somewhere.
So, how did you end up managing the Breakers, and kind of how involving was that?
Well, that was when, like, at Legend, I mean, it was Kermit, who was later with the Rap Assassins and Black Grape. who basically, I mean, I was aware of breakdancing at this point. Buffalo Gals video had been, but it hadn't kind of hit the streets in the UK. And Kermit said to me he was part of a crew and they were now going into Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester. And I went to check them out, and I suggested they do I called it a street tour of the Northwest, like shopping centres and, like town squares and stuff. And that's what we did. And we got all the newspapers in each of the towns. I'd ring them beforehand and say, oh, this New York thing, and it's this dancing, and you've got to come and see it. And they come and take photos and do a little piece. And so that was what we first did. And very soon, like, TV started to come in for them. They did local TV, Granada Reports, and then the Tube came up, a few national TV things, and they did one of the tracks on the UK Electro album that I did, Kermit and Fids rapping. So they were like, some of them were kids that came into my club, into Legend. I mean, the majority of the crew were. And so, like, it was a natural extension of that, really, that I got involved. And I was involved for maybe about probably 9 to 12 months before my life started getting a bit complicated and the money dried up and it hadn't worked out with the UK Electro as hoped and stuff. So, but it was an incredible period, like they toured around the country, and as I said, they did a lot of TV. They were very loved, very accepted, people. It was great to see. I mean, what they did for race relations, that was an incredible thing. I always remember when we did a very original street tour going into, I think it was Widnes, and seeing like groups of local lads seeing all these black kids getting out of a van and what is going on, and in an area where there weren't black people, and it was a recipe for disaster in a sense. It was like, a lot of people viewing that situation would have thought there's going to be trouble, and then all of a sudden they roll out a piece of lino and put down a ghetto blaster. And what was amazing was that I saw these young white kids gravitate towards them, and I kind of knew that many of these had never had a conversation with a black person before, and all of a sudden they're all talking and they're saying, what is this? What's this music? What's this dancing? There's this exchange going on. And it was beautiful, it was like wonderful to see that happening. And so breakdancing, did so much for bringing young white kids and black kids together and breaking down those barriers and everything, as did the jazz funk scene before that. But, breakdancing was such a kind of big, like, flash, when it happened and it opened up and everything. So that was great, that period. They carried on after I stopped managing them and did their thing for a number of years to come, and are legendary now, in British b-boy circles. Anyone, who doesn't know them as OGs, doesn't know their b-boying in this country.
So how did this then evolve into Ruthless Rap Assassins, if that's the kind of right way of putting it?
Well, Kermit again. So Kermit, who was in Broken Glass, in this interim period, while I was pretty much down on my luck, had started a rap crew with the Hines brothers, Anderson and Carton, in Hume, called the Ruthless Rap Assassins, and got in touch with me and he said, we've got a crew, I've got a tape, and he sent me this tape, and it's really kind of roughly recorded and everything, but there was straight away I thought, the attitude, love the attitude. And there was this one track, We Don't Care, and it was like a black punk track almost. It was just really in your face. It was relentless, and I just loved it. So I loved what they weren't doing anything like anyone else. It was like, these guys are original. The humor again, they struck me with the humor of the lyrics and everything. And so that's what happened. That I took on the management role with them and started producing them. We got I think initially we got Ireland to get us in the studio, and we did what became the first white label with that session. But we never signed to Ireland because guy called Ian Dewhurst who'd facilitated all that. He'd left the company, so our main contact wasn't there anymore, and the other labels were starting to show interest. And in the end, we ended up at EMI, which was mad, it was a mad label for the Rap Assassins to sign to. And if truth be told, EMI really signed them on the strength of, we also had Kermit's sister Christine and her mate Anne-Marie, and they were called Kiss AMC. And the Rap Assassins did a track called Kiss AMC, which they did live early, and the girls also did backup for a few other tracks. And when they, EMI had seen them live, they come to the Hacienda to see the Rap Assassins before they signed them. Kiss AMC on there, and I think they saw with the girls, we can sell, I think the girls looked fantastic, they had like a real great style about them and everything, although they weren't the best rappers in the world. They weren't even into hip-hop so much. They were like into the Bodines and the Smiths and all these the Sugar Cubes. I found out about Björk through them when she was in the Sugar Cube. They were into all this kind of stuff. So it was a bit of a laugh to them, and we approached it in that way as well. And they ended up doing the singles for EMI before the Rap Assassins put their album out. So I think, in a sense, we got the EMI. I think it would have just been the three guys. EMI would have been, they'd stepped away. It was too hardcore, too what they would have thought confrontational. It was rap music was seen in certain. It was the time that NWA and stuff was about to come through. Public Enemy, of course, were about and everything. So I don't think the record companies here really had a good handle on rap too much at the time. But they decided that they'd take a punt with us, and we ended up doing 2 albums for them. And it was a really great period, a 5-year period. It was sad that it came to an end, but all things do. And it was sad that they never got the sales. I wouldn't say the acclaim, because they did get the acclaim, and they still get the acclaim. And there was even a piece written for a Manchester publication only a few weeks ago all about the North Hume sound, it was a kind of throwaway line that they used. There used to be the KRS-One South Bronx, and he's saying South Bronx, South Bronx. And so they used to go North Hume, the North Hume. And then their music became known as the North Hume sound, and magazines started to print it that way. And somebody, a writer who obviously probably wasn't even born when this stuff was out, just saw it and decided, I want to find out more about that, and did a piece about it just recently. So they're still out there in the ether, but they never got the sales. We never got we fell down on, it was radio that was the problem. We never got the support on radio. Yeah, we got some John Peel plays. I mean, that was great, but we didn't get the daytime radio that we needed that would have sold the album through. We had a single called And It Wasn't a Dream, and a lot of our hopes were pinned on that. And I remember the girls who did the radio promotion, they were pushing and pushing to get it, and nothing had happened for a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden, we've got to play. It's on Simon Bates' show. He's going to play it. It was like, and it was the breakthrough, because if he played it, then maybe they could get it on the playlist or get other people to play it. And he put the wrong side on. Right. And it was a real kind of in-your-face track called Posse Strong, which was completely different. And It Wasn't a Dream's much more laid back. Posse Strong was like punching you in the face. And he never bothered, he never corrected that. He never rectified it. He never played it again. It was almost like he must have thought, I hate this band because, I put the wrong side on, it was his mistake, but it wasn't like the next day he played it again. And we never got that play. And so the radio side was such a big letdown. And they even did a couple of tracks where they were kind of, dissing radio for basically not kind of getting behind them.
I suppose it could have been a Trojan horse, like how Eminem released My Name Is, to kind of hook people in before all the darker work that is on the album.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that was the thing about the Assassins, that they could really come with serious social commentary. 2 of their tracks are rated people have said they're the best British hip-hop lyrics, And It Wasn't a Dream and Justice, Just Us. But at the same time, they could just take the piss, and that's what they were doing. They were just having fun, and So they were great fun, you know. So it balanced out. And you know, I'm not making a comparison with the Beatles or anything, but just saying that thing, you can see, like with the Beatles, that on one level you got this serious music. These guys are serious musicians, but at the same time, you know, they're just full of fun. You know, it's that kind of combination that you know we had, like with the Rap Assassins, that they could work both sides of that, and you know, and so yeah, you know, the track that was on the B side, as I say, I mean, later Roots Maneuver, he said that the Rap Assassins were at the roots of grime, and when I thought about that and looked back, I thought that these were probably the Rap Assassins tracks that, I mean, Kermit used to program these drums, and he did it on Posse Strong. He did it on a track called Here Today, Here Tomorrow, which I love, which one of Carson's tracks. And it's that kind of sound that I think he likens to, you know, what would later become grime. But it was just, again, it's just a making it up on the spot, using what you've got around you, you know, the tools, the records, you know, a turntable, a sampler, a drum machine, you know, and that's what it was, you know. It was very creative process. The way that I mean, they were very chill guys, you know. I mean, it was like you get in the studio and, you know, it could take hours to get started. It was one more spliff after the next, you know. It was like, and you just, but at the same time, I knew that once you started, they could achieve what, you know, in an hour, what it'd take another band to achieve in a day, you know.
Yeah.
They because it was spontaneous, it just exploded, and we caught it all. It was up to me later to make sense of it and pull it all together in the mix and in the edits and everything, but the actual performance, that you could get it from them, but you couldn't like force that, you know. They had to be in the right headspace for it.
Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on, so I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some Once a DJ 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from onceadj.bigcartel.com, and if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. I think with the mix as well, it's quite interesting listening to it, considering that quote about it being the sort of start or key influence in grime. Is with the mix, it seems like the stuff that I was listening to, there's a lot of space in the mix for the vocals. You know, say compared to like a Bomb Squad production or something like that, where it's just full of everything. There's, the vocals get so much sort of emphasis in the Rap Assassin stuff.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if there's anything conscious in that way. You know, we weren't like kind of, it was literally, you know, just how it came out. Guys would come with ideas, go in the studio, and we'd do it. And what was great from my point of view is that they weren't precious, so they were very welcoming of my contribution. You know, there was no problem. You know, it was like they were happy for that. You know, and so I was able to bring some things into play, like, you know, some of the indie aspects. You know, like, so the first track on there, Crew from the North. I mean, it was Sample City, that album, absolutely. We would never get it cleared if we were trying to put that album out now. Not a chance in hell. Even like within the opening few seconds, you've had you had one of them's not like an official sample, which was the guy who worked in the studio. It says, "Call Blimey, Where's Up North?" That's Paul Roberts, who is the engineer. But this is the Killers speaking, and the guitar. So you've got Jerry Lee Lewis. This is the Killers speaking. You've got the guitar from Jimi Hendrix in the background, and then you've got Ringo, which is sampled from Revolution number 9, I think, saying, "Take this, brother, may it serve you well." That's just within those opening, and then you drop into the beats, and what the beats are is Happy Mondays, right? Sampling NWA, so and now we've sampled the Happy Mondays, and that's what we use for the background for Crew from the North, and that we sampled WFL, the Happy Mondays, and which that kind of Manchester connection again straight away, and so throughout the whole album, I mean, there's just so much sample. I mean, it's loads of little bits. I mean, there's even the beats from Sgt. Pepper are underneath a track called Lord of the Jungle.
Is that the reprise?
Yes.
Sgt. Pepper's reprise. Yeah.
So, like, it was just like a field day, we never thought about sample clearance. We got to a point where EMI started to come to us and say, it was like people in their legal department had listened to the album and spotted something. And there was a couple of things we had to change. The worst thing was that I wanted to use the Steppenwolf version of Born to Be Wild. And John Kay from Steppenwolf completely refused it. And so I ended up using the Slade version. Slade did a live version, so that's the one that we had on the album. Although they did a release, and I kind of sneaked the Steppenwolf back in the. They did like a reissue like not long ago. So it was getting to a point where the floodgates were going to open, and all of a sudden we were going to have to be trying. And I got called into EMI, and basically told, look, go in the studio, we can say that you've changed something, it's almost like, go ahead and do it, but we won't say anything, but don't say that I said anything. It was a nice thing that was handed over, really. I won't say who enabled that, but they just basically put the block on checking for the samples. They said to the people who were asking, he's gone back in the studio to sort that out. And we just put it out as it was anyway, apart from the few things that we did have to change.
That's amazing, because presumably that's after the De La Soul Turtles one.
Yeah, I mean, just after, that was the domain that we were in. And remember, at that point with De La Soul, there hadn't been the big court case. I mean, they'd done that album, and obviously, again, there was a lot of comparisons made. Musically, it was different, but in terms of spirit and where we were coming from and the fact we were taking all these different sources. I remember when I first heard the De La Soul album, Ian Dewhurst, who was the guy who worked at Island Records, he wasn't at Island by this time, but he obviously was aware of the Rap Assassins, and he'd been to New York, and he brought a copy back. I remember he came to my house, my flat in London, and brought that album. And I run it off onto a cassette at the time, and I was just like, whoa, it's just like this. And because he'd seen the comparison in the way, he thought that, you're doing, you're kind of, and I was just like blown away, obviously, because it's one of the greatest, of all hip hop albums. And I remember even giving a cassette to our A&R guy at TMI and trying to say to him this, because they were always trying to push us in a slight... the amount of times we heard the term hip house, wanting to do a hip house mix, and the guys were like, we're not into it. We don't like it. We don't want a hip house. We're not into hip house, and I fought their corner all the time, so there was never a hip house mix, but I was always being pressured, do this. And what led to the downfall of it all was that our relative success with the first album, which had massive acclaim across the board, across the black music press, the rock press, everything, but not the radio. But we were with a marketing department called Strategic in EMI who dealt with specialist labels, be it dance, jazz, classical, and back catalogue they did. You know, they're quite lucrative because some of this back catalogue could sell a lot. And so they had money and it was great. And they let us get on with it. We did all our own press. You know, we did all the artwork. Brian Cannon, who later became Oasis's artwork, was the guy who did all our stuff, you know, with the Rap Assassins. That's where he got his start from. And so we had a real control base over what we were doing. We had creative control, which is mad, you know, we actually had creative control. But when we did the second album, the main EMI marketing department, by that point, had spotted us, you know, we'd done something. And so they took us over. And the big problem was that they thought they had some kind of authority on rap music because 2 American singles that belonged to Capitol, that EMI had the rights over and put out and were big hits here, were MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice. So they felt now, we you know, we know all about, you know, we've had rap hits and everything. And they didn't have the conception that this was not what the Rap Assassins were into. The Rap Assassins didn't have respect for MC Hammer and Vanilla Ice. That was throwaway stuff to them. They had respect for Public Enemy or NWA or whatever it might be. You know, they were like into serious American artists, and this was like the pop end of the market. So EMI marketing department immediately were trying to push us more into a direction that they could work with, I suppose, that they understood how to work with. And what they got was the absolute opposite of that. You know, the guys, the second album, very critical about radio, very hardcore in certain ways, uncompromising, no, you know, obvious kind of single type hits. I mean, I knew when they'd done it, I thought I absolutely backed everything about, you know, their expression that they should express, and it is expressed from the aspect of 1991 and things are less mellow. It was what was happening in Manchester. The kind of peace and love period, it was over. Manchester now was good. Gunchester, it was darker, it was bleaker, and the 2 albums reflect that. The Killer album being the, you know, the bright and the Think album being more towards the dark side. But I just knew that they're not going to like this. They're not going to want this. It's not what they're looking for, and that proved to be true. You know.
Yeah. So through this time, were you doing other sort of re-edit work or anything like that?
No, I mean, not re-edits and stuff. I mean, I did the odd bit and bob, a remix here and there, a bit of production here and there, but all scattered and, you know, nothing coherent I could get a grip on. I mean, remember, I really tried to get remixing when I was still a DJ, and it was very difficult. Eventually, Mute Records, Daniel Miller came through with a remix for me, but I would have hoped it would have been Depeche Mode or Yazoo, you know, but it was a band called I Start Counting. So, you know, just little things here and there that I did, but couldn't find couldn't get my stance in the whole situation. It was just difficult. As I say, you were at a time as well where you had to book studios and things, you know, if you wanted to make a track, it was costly, you know, and you had to get musicians. And so you were kind of learning in public in a way, you know, you weren't, you just having to do whatever you could along the way. But as I say, the Rap Assassins came into play, and that became, you know, my main source of what I was doing. And that was a 5-year period. Re-edits didn't really come back into play till I started up DJing again, and realised that now there was this re-edits culture that was emerging, and, you know, by serendipity, is exactly what I was doing when I stopped DJing, because I'd got a Revox B77. I was doing my mixes for radio. I started to be fancy with the editing on that and doing all sorts of little bits of tricks and stuff. So that was slowing down the process of making a mix rather than it being as live. It was now taking 8 hours. That seemed a hell of a long time then. Now, you can go on forever, people, because of the equipment that they've got. And so I started doing some edits actually for radio, and it was for, weirdly, a guy called Timmy Mallet. You remember him? Mallet's Mallet, Wackaday.
Yeah, he's someone I want to try and get on here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I got in touch and he was having, I sent him a message and he was like, yeah, but no. Because he broke the news about Lennon being shot, didn't he, on his radio show?
On Piccadilly, quite lightly, yeah. I mean, he had this amazing, he was later known, like being a kiddies type personality and a bit daft and everything. He always was, he always had that kind of vibe about with the glasses. But he did this show for teenagers that was absolutely brilliant. He'd get people in to make jingles and stuff. Chris Evans was on it. He was called Nobby No Level. He was like his roving reporter. He'd kind of knock on people's doors and pass a message from a girl that fancied a lad or something. It was just this like, it was all happening. And he got me to do some, asked me to do some edits for the show. So I did Frankie Goes Hollywood 2 Tribe, did, stuff that was known. And I did it also because I thought the record companies, if they could hear what I did in an edit, maybe they might, let me do a proper remix and give me a multi-track. So I did Chaka Khan, I Feel For You, which ended up on my credits of the Edit album in 2005, I think it was. And Scritty Politti, Would-Be's, again, that ended up on the credits of the Edit album. So all these, I call them turntable edits. I made them with 2 turntables, so I'd use repeat effects from the turntables. I had a cassette that sometimes I could put a little kind of sample from, and I had tape effects, like dub effects and stuff, and I just made these edits of tracks, off that. So years later, now I'm opening up to the possibility of coming back into DJing again. I've got a computer now. I've been online. I can see that there's websites that are dealing with like dance history and culture and everything. There are forums where people are discussing this. I start to join a few of the forums and people start to kind of... I also started Electro Funk Roots, which was the big thing. I got the website and now, people are saying about DJing and stuff. So what kind of, when I decided to come back into DJing, I was aware that, it was still very underground at the time, the re-edits, but it was there. And it absolutely fitted exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be Mr. Nostalgia playing the old tunes that I used to play back in the day. But at the same time, I wanted to draw from back in the day. And now, here we are, I can make edits. There are other people who are making edits that are taking some of these tracks, and that was that seemed to fit the condition that I'd set within myself of a kind of past-present balance.
Yeah.
So now I'm DJing. I'm using a reel-to-reel, which is an old antiquated piece of equipment, alongside a laptop, which is modern technology. So it's the juxtaposition of the two, I always started to look for that. So a re-edit is that. It's taken from the past, but it's doing it in a contemporary way that suits being played now and the dance floor and the mixing and everything. So, that became almost a guideline for me, that whenever something new came in, I often looked at those two aspects and are they both there for me? Yeah, that works then, because I didn't want to be kind of pulled into a nostalgia trap, which is very easy, and be, that's the guy who used to do the Hacienda, or, I've seen him, he's all right, on to the next one. I needed to cultivate an audience to, if I was going to go into a second career as a DJ, I had to cultivate an audience who are younger. You can't rely on people of, my age or even back then, 20 years ago, who would have been in the 40s, because they got families, they don't go out as much, so you need to hit people who are wanting to go out more often and everything.
Yeah, so we never actually talked about the Hacienda in the first episode, but obviously that's something that people kind of associate you with. So when was it that you were there, and what was it like?
So I was there in 83. So the club by that point had been open. It opened in May 82. It was a big space. In the winter, it's freezing cold. In the summer, the light shone through, from the roof and everything. So it was light till kind of, the acoustics in the place were terrible. The place looked great, obviously the design, we've all seen it, but acoustically it was, and it was not set up properly for a DJ when it started, because they put the DJ booth in a room to the side of the stage down some stairs, which meant you looked through a glass slat and saw people's legs. If there were people in there, because they struggled to put people in there for quite a long time. So, and I won't even go into the mixer that was like above your head. I mean, honestly, you couldn't credit what they did. They went in with the best intentions, but they just didn't have it sussed at all early doors. They got it right when they moved the DJ booth to the balcony, and bit by bit it all came together, and now we know the history. But at my time there, it was a struggle, and we had some really good one-off nights. I was doing the Friday nights, but they had a membership issue, which was hard to get people in. They had the issue with the fact that the black crowd simply thought the Hacienda was not their club. They thought this was all indie kids and students and stuff, and that had nothing to do with their experience. It was, as I say, it was a club struggling to find its identity, and we had these great one-off nights, but all in all, I mean, even though I did the Friday night, they'd say to me, we can't do this Friday or that Friday because we've already got a band pre-booked in. So it's all staggered, and it just wasn't right. But what was really important about that time was I also did an hour on the Saturday night, which was to acclimatise my Friday night audience to the type of music, because Saturday night was busy, like most clubs have a busy night on a Saturday night. So that was their one busy night. I did it with a guy called John Tracy, and I did an hour. And Broken Glass, the breakdancers, would come in with me, and they'd dance on the stage. And this was at the point where they were really, loved. It was the kind of the genesis of this happening in this country. And so they were like, the Hacienda, adored them and everything. So they even call them the Hacienda breakdancers on certain things. And so, and they appeared on the tube with Marcel King in early 84. And I think what the assassin, and I think what Broken Glass did was they gave the club for the first time a proper credibility with the young black crowd, that they now may think, they might go to something at the Hacienda, whereas before they just would have swerved it. It didn't seem like, and so I think that they planted seeds in that way, at that point, because later with the Friday night, Mike Pickering took it over in 85, and then that became Nude Night, and he did it with a guy called Martin Pendergrass, and they DJ'd under MP squared, MP with a 2, small 2, MP squared, and he basically took the kind of similar format to what we were doing on the black scene, in terms of it was the best of black. So when he was playing in 85, 86, some of those early house tracks started getting played, but there was also kind of Latin stuff, street soul, hip hop, disco. It was like a wide remit of black music, similar to how it was in the black clubs, and it was the black crowd that started to come into the Hacienda at that time because of the dance floor. They had a big dance floor, and it wasn't like sardine packed then, so there's plenty of dance space. People like a guy called Gerald Simpson was one of the kids that went in there, and Foot Patrol, who were a favourite group. I mean, Gerald, God knows how many times I've told this story, but there's no better example, really, because it kind of tells what happened at the Hacienda, because there's an assumption, I would imagine, from many people that a guy called Gerald does this track, Voodoo Ray, after he goes to this club called the Hacienda and has an epiphany hearing this house music. And that's how I think a lot of people assume that he hears this house music at the Hacienda and he goes home and does Voodoo Ray. But really, it's Gerald who was bringing the house music in the first place, and his contemporaries and people like Foot Patrol and other kids, they were the kids that were bringing it there in the first place. And in fact, if you look at Voodoo Ray, it's seen as a house track, but you can't half hear the jazz funk influences in there and the kind of electro side of it. And this is Gerald's background. It was Gerald's it was his take on all this. Yeah. It's not an orthodox house track in the way that we know. It's such an individualistic track and unique. But knowing Gerald, knowing his background as initially a jazz dancer, he was one of the kids who came in and danced to jazz. And then, he was into kind of the electronic music, the electro that came out. He started DJing and he worked with MC Tunes. They were called the Scratch Beat Masters. They were a hip-hop crew. And this was like just before Voodoo Ray and everything. So his influences were all coming from that direction. It wasn't, it certainly wasn't that he got this from the Hacienda, It was him and guys like him that were going there that was bringing this vibe into the Hacienda in the first place.
Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU's been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on, so I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some Once a DJ 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from onceadj.bigcartel.com, and if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. Yeah, I suppose this comes into the sort of folklore around the Hacienda, doesn't it? And because you were known as having been at the Hacienda, then was that kind of almost like a monkey on your back when you were coming back?
When I came back, I actually would tell people not to put Hacienda under my name in flyers.
Yeah.
I played it right down, and the reason I did that was because I didn't want it to overshadow Legend, because Legend had been such an amazing club, and I played at the Hacienda, but I'm a legendy. That's my club. That's where my greatest moments were spent. Was at Legend. So I didn't want it. It's easy for people. Hacienda, everyone knows it. I don't mind now. I changed that attitude over time. I do a lot of Hacienda events and everything, and it's great, But in that initial period, I just didn't want to, because I've seen other DJs do that who were at the Hacienda for 10 minutes. And it's Hacienda DJ, Hacienda, it's like the kind of, whereas, you were more associated with this or that, and I certainly wanted to make sure Legend, people knew about Legend and Wigan Pier as well, and that whole scene of what was going on, because to get the story in context, you needed all these pieces put into the proper places.
Yeah. So, when you went back to DJing, was it scary going back?
No, I mean, I'm not a kind of person who's got nerves about it so much, apart from, hoping all the equipment's set up right. You know, I could be quite quiet before a gig, just checking everything's in place. But I'm not someone who kind of has nerves and stuff like that. You know, I don't know. I mean, when I did come back into it, it all happened organically. I did my first gig in Manchester, and it was Danny Webb and a guy that he was working with. Danny Webb worked for Piccadilly Records, and he said, you know, let's do something in Manchester. And he seemed the right guy, and it seemed the right moment. And I'd started the website Electro Funk Roots, and I actually did for about 6 months prior to that. Might have even been a bit more. I did a little residency in Liverpool, but didn't say who I was or anything. It was just a bar residency, and it was purely to get used to the controller that I bought, this PC DJ controller that I used. So I was using that with a laptop in conjunction with it. And I initially thought I'd only go there for a couple of months. And then I got used to like having some money in my pocket for the first time in years. You know, I hadn't, you know, even like, I think it was probably only about 100 quid or something, you know, but it was great, you know, Jesus. And so I, you know, it was under the condition, you know, I just want to keep this totally on the down low, you know, and get into it. So I was comfortable with the equipment and everything by that point. And I did that first night in Manchester, and there were less than 100 there, but they were the right people. They were all kind of train spotters and DJs and stuff, and they were coming in, what's this record? And, you know, I remember they came up, like I played that Chaka Khan edit that I'd made in 1984, and they're like, wow, what is this? This is great, this, wow. And I'm like, I wish you would have been saying this 20 years ago when I was trying to get remix work. Now, I mean, it blew me away. I was like, now they get it. Now they get it. At the time, you know, like people look the other way, a bit like when they did that Tube performance, you see the people in the crowd, it's like, what's going on? Put a band on, you know, what's this madness? So, you know, that's what it was like. That's how it worked out, really.
So then did the work sort of come quite quickly?
Well, what happened was that gig was attended by Ralph Lawson from Back to Basics. And there was a guy called Richard Harcastle there who was from a club in Sheffield. It was called Society, Scuba. And both of them got me booked for... So within my next few gigs, I did Back to Basics, I did Sheffield. From Sheffield, I got a Newcastle gig. And this is what was happening. I was getting gigs from gigs, and they were multiplying. Right. So initially, for that first period of maybe 12 months, I was doing all my own bookings, and they were just coming in organically, and it was just starting to build. And then I had people approach me about agents work. I mean, in fact, it was when I did the Credit Edit too. Sav, who was behind that, he also had a DJ agency, and I actually declined at that point. I just said, to be honest, I'm fine where I am. I'll come to you if I need you, you know, like, but I could handle everything at the time. And I thought it was the personable side of it was working for me, the direct connection with people at the time. But then it gets to a point where you're getting overseas things and inquiries and stuff. And it was like the right time to get an agent involved because they can do all the logistics of your travel. You've just got to worry about your gig. They will make sure everything else is in place. And so yeah, that whole first period, it just went on. And even for years after that, for maybe, you know, many years after that, I always used to think, when's it going to plateau? You know, when does this plateau? And it wasn't. It was always moving upwards. I mean, in the end, it did kind of plateau in a sense with COVID. It was an enforced plateau that all of a sudden we were we were out of the game for close on 2 years, you know, and so I think a lot of people at that time would have gone down with that. A lot of DJs probably who DJ'd before that haven't DJ'd since or done the odd thing. It changed the whole dynamic, and but fortunately, you know, I was able to come out the other side of that, and still, you know, like the bookings come in, and I'm still in a fortunate position, you know, although that was, you know, wasn't nice not being able to, you know, get any kind of assistance for 2 years. That all the money that you've earned over the period before now is being used to get you through this time. That was your rainy day money. That was the rainy day, I suppose. We had the rainy day. So
so with the remixing, you get a lot of work through that nowadays, don't you, as well? Did that come in parallel with the growth of the DJing, or did that kind of have its own track?
No, that came in parallel with the growth of the DJing, really. That when your name starts getting around, people get in touch with you and ask for remixes and stuff. And so I mean, I don't do I kind of I'm quite choosy over what I want to do. Maybe if you slip through the net and you think shouldn't perhaps have done that one, but most of the time, like really happy with the tracks that we're working with, and so. Is
there any particular one that you wish you'd done that you were offered?
Not really. No, I don't think so. I think what I've been offered, I've always, I mean, the only time, sometimes there's a term called on spec, where you do the mix, and then if they like it, they'll pay for it. And I wouldn't do that. I would never do on spec until Grace Jones, she had a track called William's Blood, and like loads of people had a shot at it, and I thought, okay, I'll do it, and I got it. I got the mix, and she put it out and everything, and so that worked out, But generally, I wouldn't have done, I mean, with remixing, you don't get much out of it now. It's like if you were a remixer in 1992, 3 or whatever, you'd probably be earning like really, really good money out of it. Yeah. And if you had your head properly screwed on and had, a lawyer and something, you're probably getting points off each of the records and things like that. So it was a very lucrative business, for DJs to become remixers. That's all went. Once vinyl kind of went on the downturn and everything, there's not nothing, there's not big money in that at all. It's so often it's a calling card for people that keeps their name current or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can't go and make a career out of being a remixer really now.
Is it nice though, the feeling of just getting, like you were talking before about, just wanting to get access to the multi-tracks? Is it nice to be at that point, or to when you felt, when you reached that point where someone was like, for the first time, here's the multi-tracks, go for it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is, you have like weird situations. I got to remix in about, what would it be, about 88? Yellow, the Swiss band who I loved, and the track called The Race. I got to do that, but I was given like what they wanted. They wanted this sports mix. They wanted me to sample from sporting events and stuff, and in the end I had to find, try and source some stuff and get in the studio with it. And I wasn't like, I just wanted to do a great 12-inch mix, but they were like, it ended up coming out on 7-inch, and they kind of pushed me into this sports mix. But the big thing was that in the studio, it was a 48-track studio, so 24-track machines. So like they had 2 machines, and what you do is you put both tapes on there and you sync them up and everything, and there's your 48-track. So they've got a 48-track studio, but 3 tapes turn up. So there's not 48 tracks, there's 72 tracks. And I haven't got a third machine. So I'm having to make a decision on the day which multi-track I'm not going to use. So I could only use 2 of them. So, you're hamstrung in things like that. And you're not in a position where you can say, oh, let's come back in, next week because they'll be, or tomorrow because they're saying, oh, the studio's booked up, or, oh, no, we need it back today. And so you kind of find yourself in situations like that where I did a remix of Yellow, but it was really personally really disappointing to me because it wasn't what I wanted to do.
Right.
But, like now we're in a different place because we've got computers and We've got all the time we need with these things, and unlimited tracks. We're not kind of restrained to a 24-track machine or two of them, or even like, I mean, the Beatles recorded Sgt. Pepper's on 8 tracks. Is that mad?
Yeah.
You know, it's absolutely insane, you know, but people now need an infinite amount of tracks, and, you know, they need an infinite amount they need everything before they can even start, you know. Sometimes it's better to strip it all back down to basics. And I think that people will find they're a lot more creative in that way if they set conditions on themselves and don't give them, you know, say, I am going to do something tonight, not I'm going to do something in the next month. And that's how people started thinking about, like, when they're making records and tracks, because they can go back and forth between the computer forever. You know, and I think that, as I say, that has the risk of stifling the whole creative project and process. It's that you need to really build in a spontaneity into that. That's the performance. So when in the early 80s in New York, all these amazing remixes like Francois Kevorkian, Larry Levan, T. Scott, Jellybean Benitez, Shep Pettibone, all these great names, all from the DJ community, often they were getting overnight sessions. They were kind of getting what's called downtime when the studio could sell hours to them cheap. They were going in overnight and they were doing the mix. And they only had that amount of time to do the mix. And I listen back to some of those early 80s mixes, and they're so creative and they've got such a vibe about them. And I think the vibe is to do with them being, they had to be spontaneous. And so what they do in there, they get it all set up, get the mix right with what's on the multi-track, get it the way they want it sounding. And then they start to strip down, so they'd maybe run a version off without any drums. Maybe they'd run one with just the drums, maybe with the bass and drums. And they run all these onto tape, and then they go home and edit those together. So that was the whole process then. They couldn't go back to, you know, the multi-track and keep going and getting more bits. Once they've been in that studio overnight and pulled as much as they could, as many options and possibilities, that's what they did. And then they edited the mix together at the end of the day, you know. And those mixes still stand in terms of excitement and originality and vitality. So, you know, I think I always try I always feel my best work comes in that way, when that burst, you know, that you burst into a creative pattern, you know, like, and it's done quickly. I mean, I did a kind of mashup, a kind of track that I did yesterday, just sat down and it was done within 8 hours, you know. The idea just, and it worked perfectly, and it's going to be really good. I know it's, you know, I'm already feeling that it's spot on. It's exactly what, you know, like kind of thing I want to be making. And I don't think it would have been the same if I would have taken a week over it. I think you squeeze the life out of things. You sanitize things too much. You're too particular. But I was just throwing stuff into the computer here, you know, throwing onto the tracks and adding things, and, you know, it's very quick, very spontaneous, and then you sit away from it and you go, I like that, because it's got the vibe you're after, and I think that's the hardest thing to find in a record. You know, we hear it, we know when, you know, we know but, you know, you can't like just manufacture that. It's got to be, it's a human thing. It's an emotional thing.
Yeah, and just to that point as well, perfection is the enemy of done. That's what they say, isn't it? Something that we've not really got into the detail of in the episode that I'd like to understand more of is the workflow when you're live using the Revox reel-to-reel.
Well, basically what I'm doing, there's kind of couple of things to it, but the main thing that I'm doing generally is I've got all sorts of sounds, effects, kind of samples, you know, little bits of voice, kind of whooshes, recorded and separated on the tape, so I can kind of spin them in over the top of what I'm playing from the CDJs. So that's what I'm doing. I'm kind of peppering the what I'm mixing as I'm working through it.
Right.
The second thing is that you can put it into record and feed it back through itself, and that creates like dub effects. The original kind of tape dub effects. How they, the Jamaicans first kind of invented dub. It was like playing with tapes and making noises, and so. You can do a bit of that as well. So that's my main uses of the Revox. It kind of is basically there just to help spice up, what I'm doing like on a DJing level.
Yeah. So when you're doing edits now, because a couple of your edits I've used recently on mixes, they've just got this kind of real nice warmth to them. Are you working on analog gear when you're doing them?
No.
Right.
Not now. I mean, obviously, back in the day, you would do, and I did my original edits on tape. But once computers came along, it just made things so much quicker. So, for example, if back then I wanted to extend, say, a 2-bar section and make that into 16 bars, for example.
Yeah.
I had to, record that 16 times, or if it was 2-bar section for 16 bars, 8 times. So each time was a process of recording and then editing and putting the bits together, recording, editing, putting the bits together until you make that section. Whereas with a computer, you select those 2 bars and you multiply by 8, bingo, it's done. You've immediately done it. So there's no practical purpose for editing on tape. Maybe there's a kind of nostalgia or this, aesthetic side of it, if somebody wanted to do that. But really, practically for making edits now, you can do everything so much quicker.
Are you using like outboard effects and stuff, or are you doing everything in the box?
When I'm re-editing, I mean, if you go back to tape, I mean, it's literally you're taking the stereo track, and you're editing it. You're either extending it or you're reducing it, or you're trying to take out certain bits of it that you don't think work so well and using the other stuff instead. So it's really just taking what's there and rearranging it. So that's an edit, but it moves forward from that. It becomes like more like a rework. So now people will add bottom end to it. They might add a kick drum or percussion or obviously bass and stuff, and just make the track sonically fit in more with what's happening now. So you've got like the edit is just using the original track. That's all you've got to work with. The rework starts to kind of take it further and adds bits. It's now adding bits into it and everything. And then obviously a remix is when you have the actual multi-track parts of the track you're remixing, and then, you can look at everything individually. So a rework still takes the original track, but it builds into that. It kind of builds stuff around it.
Got it.
So there's different aspects of it. But as I said, when I first started editing, that's all it was. It was just kind of working with something in stereo and cutting it up for your purposes, really.
So we kind of can't move for edits these days. It's almost like an edit-demic, and there's a huge variation in quality. What are your thoughts on the edit scene today, given your history with them?
I mean, originally edits were done in New York in the 70s, and the DJs did those, and they played them off reel-to-reel tape so that they had exclusive versions of tracks, and then they might share them, or they might kind of press up a few acetates, and it was very kind of low-key in that sense, and very much happening just in, well, probably with a certain amount of DJs in New York clubland. So it didn't really kind of come into the UK. Even when I was editing in the early 80s, the penny had never fully dropped in terms of what had been happening in New York, that people were doing this. In fact, a lot of the techniques I kind of learned, and I only learned them, doing it. Nobody taught me how to do it. I just worked it out for myself. You realise these techniques were used in New York. They stumbled across the same techniques themselves. It's just that I was doing this quite a way later, you know. I mean, the edit scene in the UK really started off in the kind of 90s, and various people were doing stuff, bringing back like disco tracks, also kind of, drawing from the hip-hop break beats and stuff like that. Ron Hardy, the Chicago DJ, was a big influence to some people, and the edits that they were doing out there. So the re-edit scene kind of came in at that point, but really accelerated, into the new millennium because of the computer technology. Yeah. And the fact that anybody can do this now. As I said to you, it's what used to be a very difficult process, working on a tape and with strands of tape. Now you can do in a computer in no time. So yeah, people nowadays make edits for themselves, which is great. That's fine. Sometimes some of the edits that get out there, so to speak, it's like there isn't that kind of quality control. And, when the people that are really doing it at a high level and the energy and the effort that they're putting into doing this, you can tell, you can hear when it's somebody who's just really found a track, an older track, like you say, maybe extended the intro a bit, which is good for mixing purposes and giving it an outro so you can get out of the track, because a lot of those older tracks just faded out, and they weren't thinking of it in these terms. So, that's fine. But like you say, some of these end up, there's loads of records and stuff, and there's debatable quality to what the people are doing. Although there are people out there who do great work, but a lot of those have kind of moved more into reworks now. I think that it's a much more cultured approach to it, and that they're almost remixing the track, but they haven't got the multi. Yeah. In fact, now it's going another level because of AI, that you can separate stuff within AI, and so people are now going to be able to get into the multi-tracks, And I mean, an interesting thing was that one of the reasons that a lot of these kind of stems of tracks started coming out was, again, like the Beatles are there with that. It's, what was it called? Rock, what was the game where you had all the instruments, the Beatles instruments, and they played you the music, and they broke down the tracks so that you could have an instrumental of all the tracks, so you could, like play all the separate parts. Right. What was it called? Rock,
Rock Band.
Rock Band, of course, yeah, because it had all the band instruments and everything. And I think that there were other versions of Rock Band, and they were getting the tracks from various artists that they were featuring in it and breaking them down into the sections of the band, so that then the people who were starting to do reworks and re-edits were accessing the stems from that direction and starting to do, there's people out there that their whole thing is about finding multi-track stems and the late, new ones, and they're all over the place. I mean, there's even people who are finding old tapes now that are going through them and digitizing everything, and then they become available. And you see spates of, like, you all of a sudden see a certain track and everybody's editing it. Yeah. And it's just that it's kind of come into, it's now out there and accessible, and there's a whole space of different people wanting to do their versions of it. So, by nature, the whole re-edits thing is a little bit of Wild West, and I like it for that. I like the fact that it enables people to personalize what they're doing. But as I say, sometimes I wish people had kind of... I mean, what annoys me sometimes is when it's like, I don't mind a simple edit. Sometimes that's the best edit. Really keep it simple. Everything is great about the track, but we need to mix it in. We need to mix it out. Keep the rest the way it is. But a lot of people sometimes, they feel they need to do a few tricks almost to say, look, I'm doing an edit here. Whereas, again, going back to the Beatles, and I've said this before, the kind of single most, important edit in history in many respects, and musically, was Strawberry Fields Forever, which was two completely different versions of the track that he'd recorded. And he, John Lennon, he liked the start of one of them, he liked the rest of the other one. And so he says to George Martin, and George Martin, well, the pitch might, there might be, he was like, no, you can fix it. And he just left him to do it. And he did it. And that version we know of Strawberry Fields, the iconic, song that we all know and love, is two separate recordings. Right. It's not a single recording. So the edit, that's one edit, and that one edit is so massively important. So that means so much more than somebody doing 100 edits. Like sometimes that's way too much. You've got to keep things to a simplicity and do the right thing for the track that you're trying to play. Because, that's my premise in it. I just want to be able to play certain tracks that are hard to kind of program and mix because of the nature of the way that they are. And it's just getting a version that will enable me to do that. So it's a very direct thing, it's something I want to play. That's why I edit tracks. Yeah. It's simple as that.
Without wanting to get into like another massive Beatles conversation, don't get me wrong, I'd like to, but wasn't the medley initially all separate songs that have been kind of edited together?
The one that came out in...
The one on Abbey Road.
Oh, no, that was. Yeah, I was thinking there was actually a Beatles movie medley that was released on a single.
Right.
Probably late 70s. It was all different. And obviously there was the Stars on 45. You remember that? The famous Stars. But that was originally a bootleg 12-inch in New York. I think it was Canadian, originated in Canada. And it basically medleyed loads of Beatles records. And the guy who did the Stars on 45 was a guy in the Netherlands. He heard it, got a band or orchestra together and put it all together and sold millions.
Wow. So
the guy who came up with the original idea and did the thing in the first place didn't get anything from it. So, the Beatles, Abbey Road, yeah, of course, the editing in the Beatles is really important. It's obviously an aspect of what they were doing in various things and in their experimentation. Abbey Road, yeah, it was putting all those part tracks in certain cases together into a cohesive, brilliant, So yeah, the edit is a really creative tool, that you can see back from then.
So whilst we're kind of on the subject, and this is the last thing that I really kind of want to get into with you, is we've talked about your sort of level of knowledge and archiving around the Beatles, and now I just wanted to talk about the Record Mirror Disco Chart podcast that you and Mike Atkinson are doing. Can you tell me how that came about?
Yeah, the podcast, obviously, the book, my company's put the book out.
Right.
Mike edited it, which is James Hamilton's Disco Pages, 1975 to 1982, which covers his Record Mirror columns throughout that period, which was absolutely essential reading for DJs throughout the country. It was just the main source. So, it was wonderful to be able to do that book and get it out. Mike did such a fantastic job. And just from that, we did a podcast to help launch the book called Who Was James Hamilton, where it was just me and Mike talking. It's on Mixcloud, I think, on my Mixcloud. And just talking about James to really kind of lay it out for obviously people who had no idea who he was, which was a lot of people, probably nearly everyone under 50 and quite a few older, So we did that, and it was great. I mean, he's a natural, you know, and the whole thing like really flowed lovely, and you know, and so he just came up with the idea and said, "How do you fancy doing a podcast series where we take a record mirror chart, we have a guest, and you know, we do a rundown of the chart and talk about it?" And I just thought, yeah, that's a really good idea. You know, Mike kind of handles a lot of the kind of production of it. You know, I approach the guests and everything, and it's really worked fantastically well. You know, I've just been so happy with it. I mean, the level of the guests that we've got, it's obviously important. You have to have people that are knowledgeable and understand the time that we're talking about. So we kicked it off with Norman Cook, who did the introduction to James Hamilton's Disco Pages, the book, which is great. And also what I'm interested in as well is, like, we took Norman back to when he was like 18. You know, we didn't want to hear about, you know, the fact, well, you know, it's out of our kind of timescale, but it wasn't the Fatboy Slim aspect. It was this young guy. He wasn't even Norman Cook then. He was Quentin, you know, and we met him in Brighton at the time. And, that's how my background is with him. I was on a Hacienda tour in late 83 and with Broken Glass, the breakdancers, and he invited us back to an after party. He came the next day to the gig that we were doing. And during the sound check, I showed him the rudiments of cutting and scratching. Very much the rudiment. I mean, I was no turntablist, but I by this point worked it out, and I was able to show him, and that was interesting because he'd actually seen Grandmaster Flash in concert, but didn't know what he was doing because from his vantage point in the crowd, there was no cameras on the decks or anything, so he could just see somebody up there, and he couldn't work out what was going on. So this enabled him. It unlocked something. He went back to Brighton and, you know, he head down and practiced and went through his time with the House Martins. And then, like, towards the end of the decade, he's kind of doing dance music and turning up with Beats International, getting to #1 with Dub Be Good to Me. And that was like, at that point, I read something. I was reading, I was in London. I was going to an EMI meeting. We had the Rap Assassin signed to EMI at the time. And I was reading either Enemy or Melody Maker. And it was Beats International. And I'm Norman Cook, House Martins. Yeah, you know, and I'm getting an angle on who's made this record. And then he says influences, and he mentions Grandmaster Flash, and he mentions me. And I was like, I mean, I hadn't DJ'd at this point for 6 years or 5 years or whatever. And so I was way out the loop. I was kind of a forgotten man. And all of a sudden, this guy is saying I'm an influence for some reason. So it kind of stumped me. I didn't know who it was. I was thinking, I don't know anyone from Hull. And I asked, like, Kermit from the Rap Assassins later. I said, this thing, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's Quentin." And I was like, he said, "The guy from Brighton," and so that's who it was. And Norman was Quentin, you know. And so he ended up doing a couple of remixes of the Rap Assassins on the back of that. And then later down the line, I did a really nice interview with him. Again, no questions about Fatboy Slim. I mean, it had all been asked. What I wanted to know was his background, his musical influences, where he'd come from. So probably asked him a lot of questions he'd never been asked before on that level, and did that interview. And so, again, later down the line, when the book came up and we're thinking about somebody to do the intro, Norman was a big James Hamilton fan. When I did the Discotheque Archives, my own book, which had like classic DJs, classic venues, records and labels. And one of the classic DJs I'd done was James Hamilton, who, as I say, people wouldn't have known who he was at the time. And Norman, you know, picked up on that straight away, and he was saying how big he did. We did a book talk. He's got a place called the Big Beach Cafe in Hove, and we did an interview on outside there. It was great, you know, and you know, so he was a big James Hamilton fan, so it kind of figured, and so he was sort of it worked with him being the first guest on the podcast series too. And that was great. And so then we did, our second guest was Dave Lee, Joey Negro, or formerly Joey Negro. Again, brilliant, and again, taking Dave back just a bit before he was a DJ, when he was kind of teenage, getting into music, what was his influences, and it was brilliant, like such depth out of we did Jeff Young, who, a forgotten figure in lots of respects. This guy was on Radio 1 between 1987 and 90, through the kind of start of the rave era and everything. He was the guy before Pete Tong. Without Jeff Young, you don't have the essential selection. It was Jeff's, pioneering of that kind of time slot that opened it all up and everything that we know since. But he's kind of been forgotten in many respects, and yet he was such an important DJ and a brilliant presenter. And again, having him as a guest and his knowledge and depth, and it's great. I have history going back with him to the early 80s when he worked for Phonogram Records. He was in the club promotions and everything. And I'd go down there. He brought Kool and the Gang to Legend, my club, and I remember, I got the Buffalo Gals video of him before it was even on the TV, and I was able to play that in a club in Huddersfield and blow people's minds. So, there's history there on that level. Morgan Khan was our latest podcast, and Morgan, what he did in the 80s and the whole street sounds and the kind of culture that pervaded around that, the hip hop coming into play, his electro series opening that up, but so much more. The street sounds that he did high energy albums, he did classic stuff, he did house stuff when he was right there, a pivotal figure like James Hamilton within the music business, that all of a sudden 20-30 years on, no one knows him, no one knows who he is. There's books written, no one's written about him, it doesn't exist. The fact that he was releasing all these albums that were going into the commercial pop chart, because compilations could qualify then. You're having electro albums in the pop chart regularly and stuff. So you're having kids that had no exposure to the kind of black music culture that I was a part of within, like cities like Manchester and London and Leeds, Sheffield, all these where there were black communities. There were these kids that had never met black people in their lives that were now getting seriously into this electro music and what then becomes hip hop. And so his cultural effects is massive, is seismic. And yet, again, he's not somebody that's there in the acknowledged history. And that's such a, and when you hear him, wow, what stories. And he's there at the, he was there at the birth of hip hop. I mean, as we know it in terms of records, we talk about Rapper's Delight, and that's the one that ignited the whole thing. Now, he went over to New Jersey, where Sugar Hill were previously a label, they were called All Platinum. And they'd had all sorts. They'd had Shame, Shirley and Company. They'd had Moments and Whatnots. They'd had Retta Young, Brother to Brother, all sorts of artists, like through the 70s. A great label in its own right. They got to the end of the decade. In fact, you can see the changeover. There's a track called We Got the Funk by Positive Force that was released in America on one of their labels, Turbo, but came out here on Sugar Hill.
Right.
And it was Morgan that released that along with Rapper's Delight and got a hit out of it here, big hit with We Got. So it was the bonus to Rapper's Delight. But basically he went over there and he was young. He was like a very brash guy. He was, really doing great on the club promotion side. Pi Records, or PRT Precision as they later became, sent him over to meet the Robinsons, Sylvia and Joe Robinson. And while he's there, he's hearing like Rapper's Delight and We Got the Funk, and he's going back there and saying, yeah, we should take this label. And then they do, and they get the UK kind of hit. It's, becomes a top 5 hit here. It's obviously for a period of time, Rapper's Delight was regarded as a novelty. And rap was regarded as a novelty that, yeah, it was seen as a one-off. There was a few more, like Curtis Blow did stuff, but it wasn't taken seriously until 82 when Grandmaster Flash Furious 5, The Message, that absolutely took it to another stratosphere, and this socially conscious, expression, it grew from being a party kind of vibe, which it was initially. So Morgan, is there, literally right at the beginnings of certain things, and that kind of wealth of knowledge, the fact that we don't draw from it, we haven't got the sources properly where people understand, so yeah, it's always, great to, Morgan's a bit of a divisive character as well, and there's a lot of people who, and I think this is part of the reason why he became obscured, because when the Street Sounds empire went belly up in the end, it left a lot of people out of pocket.
Right.
And so I think, there was that kind of aspect to it. But I just deal in the history and the facts of these situations. You can't write people out of history because you feel that they didn't do the right thing in a certain situation. Maybe they didn't, but, you've got to look at the overall picture and say, they did this, it wouldn't have happened in the way it did, but for their intervention at this point in time. And he's very much one of those characters.
Yeah. And I think, as well as the guests, just all of you on the podcast, it's really interesting hearing the DJ perspective of the time when the songs came out. Right. And hearing how James would describe songs as well, and things. It's just it's a massive history lesson, not only in terms of the songs, but in terms of, I guess, where DJing was at that point, where labels were at that point, where society was even.
Definitely. It's like, if I go back to my Discotheque Archives book, the tagline on that was, to know the future first, you must know the past. And, I very much believe that if you have this kind of knowledge on board, because things repeat themselves as well. If you look at history, there's loads of repetition. You look at current affairs now, you know why it's happening, because this happened before. Things repeat themselves, and it's the same with music and culture and anything, it goes through different kind of periods. And so if you understand that and see where it's been before, it gives you an indication of where it might be going now. Obviously the environment's completely different. The way we make music, the way we consume music, all these things are different. But, there's a kind of spirit that underlies, that you see it, and you see the cautionary tales as well. It's like, when we got into the 2000s, we had the whole spate of pop stars from talent shows. We had that became the norm, that the pop stars were now being created via TV talent shows. We'd had that before, but they hadn't really created a lot of pop stars because the pop stars created themselves. It came from a different direction. But if we went a little bit further back before that, we're back in the same place. There's a guy called Larry Parnes in the early 60s, and he had a stable of male kind of pop artists who he gave names like Marty Wilde and Johnny Gentle and, these kind of, Rory Storm. It was all, they were all named and they were geared towards a young teenage female market. And you see that later on with Simon Cowell and what happens. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, but they're doing it in different ways at different points in time. And so, that kind of thing with history, it's always the cycles that are going on all the time, especially in music and culture, that you see these cycles going on all the time.
Yeah. So, I had my mate Hudson down in my office earlier on, and he's listened to the recording of episode 2 and the deep dive on the Beatles and stuff. And we were talking about that, and he was kind of saying, with the Beatles, they were almost like the first band in a way, in that they kind of, everything was, they wrote everything and sung and played the instruments, and it was all kind of one unit like that.
Yeah, I mean, in that respect, although, you go, like, Elvis never wrote his tracks. The guy that did, and they had a massive respect for him. And in fact, later Paul McCartney got his publishing, was Buddy Holly.
Right.
I mean, Buddy Holly was like doing his own stuff. And so there was a precedent for that. But in terms of the UK, what was going on at the time, and the pop acts that were, like, as I say, they were coming out of these kind of stables of managers. And then you had Cliff Richard, who was the kind of British Elvis. Yeah. Every country had their own Elvis. And the group The Shadows, they became a thing in their own right as an instrumental group. And that was the musical climate when the Beatles came along. It was so for them to draw, as we talked about previously, from like rhythm and blues and, to do things like Isley Brothers, Twist and Shout. We know that as a kind of Beatles classic, but that was the Isley Brothers who recorded that. And they also recorded Shout, which Lulu covered. I mean, they're all over the place, these tracks that were covered by. I think that one of the famous examples, although it wasn't a black act, it was the Righteous Brothers, was Cilla Black would often cover the big American hits, like Anyone Who Had a Heart, which was a Dionne Warwick track, and get the track out over here first and get the hit in England before it was released from the Americans. So this is what was happening all the time. And what was it? You've Lost That Loving Feeling. Who did the other version? I can't remember who covered it, and it was going up the charts, and the Righteous Brothers was coming out, and that was behind it. So it looked like the other version was going to be the hit. Right. And Andrew Lou Goldman, the manager of the Rolling Stones, took it upon himself to put an advert in the press saying, "You got to get this. This is the version." It had nothing to do with him.
Wow.
But he just felt so strongly, obviously, because it is the version, like the Righteous Brothers version. This whole thing of British artists taking black music or American music and recording it and getting the hits over here. I mean, it happened with the Stones. It's all over now. That was the Valentinos, black American band with Bobby Womack, and everybody thought that was a Stones record. Even now, if they heard it, oh, that's the Stones. Jagger and Richard must have wrote that. They didn't start writing till afterwards. And what started them writing, again, we go back to the Beatles. Because I think they'd done the first Stones single, I think may have been a cover of a Buddy Holly track. And then, the Beatles, like, basically, I Want to Be Your Man. They knocked it off in front of the Stones. It was a knockoff track that they did. And the Stones saw them do that and went, hang on a second. And, they covered that, and it wasn't a massive hit, but it gave them the exposure to get to the next level and everything. So it really helped in that, and especially the connection with the Beatles as well. And it was only after that Lou Goldman kind of basically locked Jagger and Richard away and was like, right, made them right almost. And then they got it, and they became their own writers. So yeah, the Beatles were inspiring everyone.
Yeah. And
everyone in terms of how they were approaching music.
And yeah, you mentioned Cilla Black. Like, it's easy to forget because of all the TV work, but she was huge, wasn't she?
Well, she was managed by Brian Epstein, who managed the Beatles, and Epstein loved Cilla Black. I mean, she was the cloakroom girl at the Cavern. Her real name was Priscilla White.
Yeah.
So her stage name was Cilla Black. So she was the girl who was behind the cloakroom at the Cavern while the Beatles were playing and everything. And so Epstein, I think he saw a little bit in a kind of sense of, My Fair Lady, like that kind of taking somebody, and making them into, she was just a Scouse girl, wasn't she? And he made her into this glamorous kind of star. And Burt Bacharach wrote a track, for her and stuff like that. And that was all Epstein's, theatricality, I would imagine. That's his kind of theatricality that would make him want to work with someone like Cilla Black in that way.
Incredible. So just going back to the podcast, all I can say to anyone listening is if you're enjoying the sort of deep dives that we're getting into here, then if you get the Record Mirror Disco Chart podcast, there's plenty more of this sort of thing going on. The knowledge in it is phenomenal.
Oh, thanks. I'm really glad you've enjoyed it because, we're having fun doing it. It's really working out. And as I say, the flow's right. It feels right.
Yeah, it's really good.
And it feels balanced. Mike's brilliant, his kind of whole kind of approach and his passion for everything. And, so it really, it's something that I'm really glad we did.
Yeah. Greg, we've had camera issues, we've had internet issues, we've had microphone local recordings over multiple sessions. You've given me so much time and you've been so patient kind of going through the problems and things. I cannot thank you enough for that. Is there anything else that you think we need to cover that we've not mentioned?
I mean, I'm not sure. I could say that this year will mark the 50th anniversary of when I started DJing. So, that becomes a bit of a landmark for me. Really interesting. I mean, I kind of worked the dates out and everything when I did my first mobile disc. I already knew when I did my first club date. I always date things to that, the 6th of December. It was but before that, for a few months, I was actually earning a few pennies doing mobile discos and everything. That's how I started out. And I got the club date by doing a mobile disco in the venue. They had functions rooms upstairs, and downstairs they had the kind of club room. And the DJ hadn't turned up, and I managed to go down, and that's how I started off when I was 15. So, revisiting that in a sense and remembering, like where it all kind of came from, which again ties in with the Record Mirror Disco charts, because we just did a really interesting one. I'll give you a kind of, something that's coming up. I won't say who the guest is, but I mean, we wanted to cover the first Record Mirror Disco chart, which we did. It's great. I'm really glad we did it, but it's a horror of a chart. There's some awful, some stuff in there that you just think, what? Where, and I mean, Slade, Status Quo, and the one that, you cannot be named is even in there.
Yeah. GG,
if you know him. So, it shows, like you said before, what the thing with the Record Mirror, or the James Hamilton Disco Pages book, it just illustrates the course of how disco culture worked in this country, not on a specialist level. There were always clubs that were playing, going back into the early 70s and even in the 60s, that were playing imported Black American music, were going for the latest stuff and everything. But this was a minority in terms of the great ocean of clubs that were out there. And this is what James tapped into. So when the charts began that he did, a lot of the DJs that were submitting them came from what were called DJ associations, and they were mainly mobile DJ associations where you get discounts on certain things that, so they'd have their own kind of newsletter and magazine. And so it was these kind of DJs. Now, most DJs didn't bother with disco associations, and certainly people who were playing black music or whatever. So the initial charts, you can see the pop aspect, and it's very honest, it's very honest, because it says if you walked into, most cities in the country, you walked into a club around this time, you're likely to be hearing, if you stuck around long enough, things like, that are in this. So, that changed over time, because what James was aware of, because of his previous history, he was a rhythm and blues DJ going back to the early 60s. He worked in The Scene, which was the famous mod club until its closure in the mid-60s. And so he had that background, and so he always had that connection with specialist black music and the specialist black scene, although when he started the record Mirror Columns, he was a bit disconnected. He was doing mobile discos himself, but he was doing like grand balls, he was moving in the upper classes.
Right.
He was their DJ of choice. That's how he made his bread and butter. So, but he very much brought in, as well as he could, the jazz funk scene as it was evolving. And so by the end of the 80s, you can see the whole music, the end of the 70s, you can just see the whole music climate changing. Whereas like people who might have been playing in their club, 5 years ago, like the pop hits in the charts, were now, starting to play a few really tasty jazz funk tunes amongst the stuff. And you can watch that evolution. In fact, in the end, they separated the dance chart and the pop-based, what they were. I mean, that's another thing, and I haven't even mentioned this in any of the podcasts yet. But there was a term back then that described these DJs, and often in print from James, he did even little features as a heading, and it was Wally DJs. So a Wally DJ. And sometimes, he said that, he wasn't always kind of putting them down. It's just that they were, and that was his descriptive term for them. But what a Wally DJ was somebody on a Saturday went to the record shop, looked at the top 40 or 30. Maybe they even did, they did that on Top of the Pops. They watched what was on the chart. They went in and they bought the new entries or whatever. And that's what they played. They played what was in the charts or what had been in the charts. And that was what you were going to get from them. And so that was his description. They were like, in the end, he realized that all that they were doing by the charts that they were sending in was basically, it was behind the pop charts, because they weren't interested in new music. They were interested in popular music, something that was already popular. So they were almost staggering the charts because they were playing stuff like after the event. It had already been in the charts and they were still submitting it in their kind of dance chart. So we separated it off, had a separate pop-based chart for a while, and then just dropped that altogether. It was, because like he said, you may as well look at the normal chart.
Yeah.
As look at, what the pop DJs are playing. And so, that was the Wally DJs for you then.
Amazing. So given that you've got 50 years in and out of the game, have you got one key piece of advice for DJs that would be sort of as relevant back then as it is now? Well,
yeah, I think, the thing that's always constant is, like the technology changes. Now, back then we played off like garage, Tiktronic turntables. They were belt driven. They weren't, something to be mixed with. We had a microphone and we introduced a back announced record. So now, you've got any amount of technology that you can bring to bear. So massive changes there. But the thing is always the same. It's this reciprocal action between you and what music you're bringing to bear and the audience that you're working with. And I always say reciprocal because, you've got to work with an audience. You're nothing without the audience. But I think one of the things that happened like post-rave that I started to hear people saying, DJs saying, it was when they started talking about sets. Sets was never a term that we used back in the day. A set was something a band did, and they wrote it down on a piece of paper. So that their set list. So now they were talking, these DJs in kind of early 90s, it'd be, were talking about sets. And I was now realizing what they were telling me was that throughout the week, they were practicing what they were going to play at the weekend. So they were locking in the mixes.
Right.
And what they were going to do is recreate that at the weekend, which kind of blew me away a little bit, because for me, the live thing is different. You know, that was almost like doing a studio thing, getting a mix together, and then, all right, I get it, you know, but to me, there was no room for spontaneity within that. No room for going off. No room if the audience aren't to move it in a different direction. You were locked into something. And so I hear people saying, I hear some DJs sometimes saying, oh, you know, the audience was shit. They didn't have a clue. They were just a waste of time. You know, and I'm like, yeah, you know, you can't say that about the audience, because the audience are what they are. They might not get exposure to the type of music that, you know, you want to play to them. The person who the problem is here is the promoter. They shouldn't have put you as a DJ in with that audience. It didn't work, obviously. But you weren't in a position that you could see that audience and be able to say, look, it's not going to work out the way that I hoped it was here, but am I going to connect with them, and are we going to have a good night, or is it just going to be, you know, a non-event, you know? And so I think that you've always got to be adaptable in your circumstance. You can't lock yourself in, you know. I think that takes it too far when you know exactly what you're going to play. And also, you might be going into a city or a town where you've never been before, and you're going in knowing exactly what you're going to play. You know, it might not work. You've got to somehow work this out, you know, for yourself. As I say, a promoter can put you in the wrong place. Well, you shouldn't blame the audience, because, you know, it is all about exposure. And I mean, it's like, I see places now that were once hotbeds of music. They were great. There was underground scenes there, you know, and there's nothing there now. There's no scene or you know, there's a detachment with the youth from the culture, you know, like, and so that's it. You know, it's difficult enough as it is, because of the climate that we're in, with clubs closing down, and it is a big difference now. And I don't know if we can ever. You can never get it back. You can never go back to stuff. But I don't know if, you know, what it'll take to recapture the spirit of what we've seen happen in the past. You know, it was, you know, when you look at scenes like rave and punk and hip hop, it's spirit. People have become, you know, so engaged with it and everything that it's just part of. And I don't know if we have that so much now. I think we might have lost it to a degree, and I don't know how we come back to it. Although at the same time as that, I do believe we'll come back to something brilliant. You know, I think every generation has its own culture and will reinvent. Sometimes things stagnate for a while. It's again like going through history, you know, like there's different periods of time where at some points that we're really at a creative level, then we kind of peak with it, and then it goes through a period where, yeah, people are still doing stuff, but haven't we heard it before? Doesn't it sound familiar? Doesn't it sound like someone else? You know, you have that kind of period, and then eventually something comes along, just like when we go back, you know, like to the early 60s, something comes along like the Beatles and tears it all up, or something comes along like Sgt. Pepper's and tears it all up, or Dark Side of the Moon, you know, or you know, going back, Ray Charles and What I Say, you know, and these moments ignite and inspire, and I suppose that's what we're kind of waiting for. It's also that the media's so fragmented now. So again, if we go back to the 60s, and if you wanted to hear the Beatles, apart from on a record on the radio, you had one chance a week. The BBC did a light entertainment programme. This is like before Radio 1 came along in 67. So once a week you could hear pop music on BBC radio. Once a week you had Ready, Steady, Go, which was a great programme. So everyone's tuned into that. Once a week you have Top of the Pops.
Yeah.
So you have, you know, you have a few music magazines. you know, you don't even have Radio 1 till 67. You have the pirate stations. If you can kind of tune in, you can get, and they're playing really good music and really interesting black music and what will become kind of rock music and stuff. So that's where it was. But what that did, and the big positive, is that if you appeared on Ready, Steady, Go, the eyes of the nation were on you. If you went on Top of the Pops, you were going to, you know, make a lot of money just for that one appearance, because loads of kids the next day would be going out and buying your record. And now we don't have those centralized bases. They're all disseminated, you know, they're all kind of scattered, and so it's very difficult to create a coherent scene because, you know, everything's all over the place.
Yeah.
But it will eventually find its way, as these things do.
Amazing. Right, Greg, I'll let you get off and live your life. Thanks ever so much for all your time. It's been fantastic. Awesome. All the best. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk.